Firstly, a quick change to the title of my talk. I'll be talking about ecological and social aspects of marine reserve networks in the Philippines. I'll acknowledge a large group of co-authors to this presentation. And thirdly, basically say when I talk about social aspects of marine reserves, I'm getting way out of my comfort zone. I'm a complete charlatan when it comes to that topic. Fortunately, my colleague of 36 years, Angel Alcala, is one of the fathers of community-based marine resource management, and everything I've learned, I've pretty much learnt from this guy. And when I speak about this stuff, I certainly bask in the reflected glory of the great man. I was sort of thinking about when I first went to the Philippines and met Angel for the first time. It's probably fair to say I was young and I was arrogant. I was considering myself a bit of a hotshot fish counter from Ames. And my attitude to Angel is, you show me your reserves and I'll count the fish in them for you. So it was pretty much that attitude. I didn't have a great deal of interest in how the reserves were set up or how they were maintained at the time. Probably fair to say that from a very early age, for me, it was pretty much all about the fish. I figure that photo was taken about 60 years ago. This one was taken not longer. That's me on the right, and that's me on the right again. That was taken when I was at Ames, about the time I went to the Philippines. Oh, is it just me, or is it getting hot in here? Many people would claim that. I've only got 15 minutes, hang on. Many people would claim that even in my old age, my focus on fish sort of borders on delirium. But for Angel, and I figure this photo was taken about 70 years ago because he turns 90 next year. That's him there with a cross on his chest. It's all been about the people. He spent the last 50 years of his life sitting in fishing villages in the Philippines, talking to fisher folk, talking about conservation of coral reefs, talking about sustainability of reef fisheries, and talking about setting up marine reserves. So why do people set up marine reserves? Just quickly, most of us know two major reasons. Conservation. In the Philippines, we've found that when the reefs get better, it's very good for tourism, particularly dive tourism. But the major focus of setting up the reserves in the Philippines right from the very outset was fisheries management, the idea that the reserves will become eventually net exporters of targeted fish biomass by adult export, larval export out to the fished areas and help sustain the fisheries in the long term. So Angel has spent, as I said, about 50 years sitting in fishing villages, talking to people about this and implementing it. And this story really starts with this photo here. It was taken in 1973 on Sumilon Island. It's that tiny little island on the southern coast of Cebu. It's the first community-based marine conservation and education program meeting that was ever held in the southern Philippines. It led to the implementation in 1974 of Sumilon Reserve, not very big, 3/4 of a kilometre long, but 25% of the fishing area around that island. And Angel and his biologists and social scientists went into this fishing community and started talking to them. And what they did, I stand in awe. It's just absolutely brilliant. What they did not do is say to them, right, loosen up, we're from the university, listen to what we say, this is what's going to happen. They did exactly the opposite. They asked the fishing people, what are your problems? We're worried whether our kids and our grandkids will have fish to catch. Why are you worried about that? Mainly because commercial fishing operations, sometimes using bombs and cyanide, can come up to the front of our reefs and fish the hell out of our reefs, and we can do nothing about it. It's all controlled from Manila, the fisheries at the time. Gee, that is a problem. Have you thought about setting up a local municipal legislation to turf them out? No. Can we do that? Don't know. Let's give it a go. And it was a dialogue. It was going back and forth between the fishing community and the scientists. And it was done in a way that all the great ideas, the municipal legislation, the marine management plans, the marine reserves, came from the fishing folk themselves. The stakeholders had the ideas. When that happens, they have an ownership of it. And that's what's happened in a very large extent. And Angel, for the last 50 years, has talked about all these buzzwords you see in social science about social preparation and community organisation and environmental education and community empowerment. He's not only talked the talk, but he's walked the walk for pretty much the last 50 years or so. Now, we set up Semillon in 1974. About 8 years later, Angel was instrumental in setting up Apo Island, a very famous reserve again. Again, small, 500 metres long, 10% of the fishing area, not very large. An enormous part of the sell, if you like, from Angel was that when you set up these areas that you don't fish, the fish that you target will build up inside those reserves, and eventually they'll start to spill out over the edges a little bit, and they'll start to influence the local fishery, in this case, by adult export. And we spent a lot of time with underwater visual counts and fishing pattern distributions and so forth, showing for 30 years that this stuff really happens. But of course, if you're fishing on a reef, you're not really interested in what a scientist underwater counts underwater. You're interested in, if they take 25% or 10% of my fishing area away from me, what the heck's that going to do to my catch? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Going to stay the same? It's a set of data we published about 13 years ago, a long-term set of data at Semillon and Apo. On the top panels is the biomass of targeted fish inside the reserves. On the bottom, the absolute catch around the island. The white dots are pretty much a biomass and catch before the reserves were implemented, and the black dots after the reserves were implemented. At Semillon, over about a decade, as the biomass built up, the catch actually went up, which is quite interesting. At Apo, as the biomass went up, catch didn't go up, but it was sure a little bit higher than it was initially. The one thing you can say about that data unequivocally, and I'm sort of relatively proud of it because it's a very long-term study, is when they took 10% or 25% of the fishing area away, the catch sure as hell did not go down. And that's a really important result. So with this sort of information was taken to a whole heap of fishing villages all over the southern Philippines. And about 18 years after that first meeting in 1973, the national government of the Philippines passed a legislation called the Philippine Local Government Code in 1991, strengthened by the Fisheries Code in 1998. And that gave coastal municipalities authority to co-manage marine resources with the national government out to 15 kilometres. So in this map, most of the fisheries were controlled centrally by Manila initially. Then all of a sudden, all those yellow areas, which are the coastal municipalities, had a say in the management out to 15 kilometres, which is the light blue. If you think I'm drawing a bit of a long bow in suggesting that that all started at Semillon and Apo, Angel is not just a scientist. He sat as the secretary, which is the minister for the Department of Natural Resources and Environment in the early 90s, and had a lot to do with those legislations. 1991, with that legislation implemented, there was almost an exponential increase in the number of reserves, both in area and number, in the Philippines. If you look at the current map today, there's about 1,800 of these. They're not big, they're small. 90% of them are sort of managed by local municipalities and villages. They protect a very small part of the coral reef area. The management is devolved mostly down to the municipality level these days, but there are still major problems with overfishing and so forth. We all know that. In the last sort of 8 to 9 years, maybe a decade now, we've been particularly interested in if you've got a reserve network like this, is the biomass of targeted fish going to build up in those reserves? Are they going to connect with each other and possibly by larval dispersal and possibly have some sort of synergistic influences on each other in terms of recovery? Most importantly, are they going to send larvae out to the fished areas and enhance the fisheries by recruitment subsidy? And a little something that Jess is going to talk about in the next talk, a little bit about do they self-recruit as well, because they're very small. So the key point that we're interested in was the idea that these areas that were protected from fishing might affect the local fisheries or the fisheries abroad, outside the areas with recruitment subsidy. Now, the first thing we did to address this question came out of Rene Abesamis' PhD thesis in 2012, where he developed a larval dispersal model. It's fairly primitive by the standards that we're using now. It's a particle tracking model, Lagrangian model, and he looked at the 39 reserves in that red triangle you can see that includes Semillon and Apo. For the modelling exercise, we used tropical snappers as a major targeted, heavily fished group, And the green dots and the blue dots here are pretty much estimates of the egg production in the reserves and in the fished areas over time, the longer you protect reserves. And you can see it's a fairly distinct difference that most of the spawning is going on in the areas that are not being fished. The result is remarkably predictable and fairly simple. On the y-axis, you've got recruits to the fished areas. On the x-axis, various different scenarios. 2008, when we were protecting only about 6% of the coral reef area, that was producing about half the recruitment of snappers in that area, according to the model. If we were to protect 10% of the coral reefs by no-take marine reserves and protect them for 5 years, the supplement would be about 200%. And if you protected about 15% of the coral reefs, over 20 years, that would produce about 8 times more recruitment than the fished areas. Now, that's sort of predictable. It basically means, as Bob Warner calls it, the scorched earth policy, or scorched earth situation, sorry, that most of your spawners are in the areas that are being protected. Now, we figured we needed to know a lot more about empirical larval connectivity, so we started in 2011 this program, mostly run by Rene Abasamis again, collected about 5,500 fish. Our target, our sort of study organism was a butterfly fish. In this case, we used genetic parentage analysis to look at try and relate where the recruits were to where the adults were. Now, here's the set of data. It was published last year, early last year, and it's the first set of data from this program on larval connectivity. And the white dots there are the reserves around the coastline of southern Negros. And the great thing about this set of data is it's suggesting that as a network of reserves, it's doing everything you want it to do. You're getting reserve-to-reserve connections, you're getting reserve-to-fish connections, you're getting fish-to-reserve connections, you're getting fish-to-fish connections, and some level of self-recruitment, as you'll see in the next slide. You scale that up a little bit. There's the same data from 2011 and 2012. Rene and his team have been out there in 2014 and 2015 and scaled that up out to Siquijor and across to Bohol. Now we've used, and again, same sort of thing, reserve-to-reserve connections, reserve-to-fished, fish-to-reserve and fish-to-fish, so, and a little bit of evidence of recruits coming back to very close to where they were spawned. Now Mike Bode takes that sort of empirical data and he produces larval dispersal kernels for that species. And Eric Tremmel takes those larval dispersal kernels and puts them into his much more sophisticated larval dispersal modelling. And that's one of the recent printouts that Eric sent me the other day. That's for a surgeonfish. And you can see it's 168 release sites. And the one thing that strikes you, hopefully, from that is that the system is fairly well connected in terms ecologically. There's the larvae are going in a lot of spatial connectivity there, right across the Bohol Sea. Now, so we know a little bit about the significant demographic connectivity on an ecological scale, but what about the social connections around that Bohol Sea there? Those orange areas that you see are pretty much 141 municipalities, all have some sort of say in how these reserves are set up and how the marine resources are managed. And Vera Harige and Rebecca Weeks have gone into those 141 municipalities and done social surveys in those areas, interviews with coastal resource managers, asking them things about information sharing, about and joint management procedures and so forth. And some of the early data from Rebecca, who sent me this the other day, is that some of the social connectivity based on those social surveys between the local government units, they're colour-coded, and you can see the colours form little cliques and little alliances. A few major points to note: there are very few bridging ties across the whole network. Most of the little alliances, if you like, tend to cluster in provinces. There's remarkably little information sharing across islands, that one being the classic case across Tanyon Strait between Negros and Cebu. People ain't talking to each other. And very often the cliques, the little alliances tend to form in bays. So if you look at those two types of connectivity, the ecological connectivity on the left and the social connectivity on the right, it's pretty clear that the larvae don't take much interest in human politics, obviously. They're not listening to where the municipalities are. They're sort of very well connected, if you like, and yet the people in terms of managing those systems are not as well connected as the fish in this case. We have other simulations from Eric as well, including invertebrates and corals as well. If we try and take some general sort of conclusions out of that, not too surprisingly, after all these years, we're still trying to implement more and larger no-take marine reserves, particularly larger ones. That we completely acknowledge that some of them are really spatially, physically small. Something I didn't talk about in this talk, but I've held for the last 35, 36 years, is we really need to have other things besides reserves. We need conventional fisheries management outside these no-take marine reserves. And probably most germane to this talk is the fact that we need to encourage more spatially extensive social connectivity, probably some sort of institutional bridging process that links up those municipality alliances that are not exactly talking to each other, exchanging information and starting to manage. So we need to, after having sort of come from a big scale management down to a small scale management, we're starting to scale up a fraction as well. So if you go back to that original meeting in 1973, some of the first items on the agenda were social preparation and community empowerment of fishing communities. And it's rather ironic, rather amazing to me, having been involved with it for a long time, that 45 years later, some of the key components of the project are empowering fishing communities to form alliances to better manage their marine resources. So it sort of makes a slightly older and a slightly less arrogant scientist sort of contemplate the possibility that maybe it's not all about the fish. Thank you.